After you're done editing your images, you're probably going to want to export them for specific use. For example, for sharing on social media sites, your website, or perhaps even for printing. Now, I'm going to show you how to do exporting of images in Lightroom, but you could use any other software, and the things that I talk about in Lightroom Export window generally do apply to most other software, just because the concepts and the methodology that I use is going to be very similar. So why do you need to export images in the first place? Well, if you use software like Lightroom or Photoshop, you're probably working on the original raw images. And remember, raw image is not something that's actually post-processed. Everything that you do in Lightroom is saved within Lightroom, but it's not saved to that image itself. That original raw file is not modified. So if you take that image and you send it over to a person that is supposed to be, for example, doing your printing, they might not even be able to open that image. That means that you need to convert your original RAW file to a compatible format, and it's going to be something like Jpeg that other people are going to be able to open and use. Now, if you're doing this for example, social media, different social media platforms will have different requirements. So you need to export images not only in a compatible format that other people will be able to, and other platforms will be able to read and understand, but also have something that is generally recommended for that specific platform. I have Lightroom open already, and I have an image that I already post-processed, and this image from Death Valley, Zabriskie Point, is now fully done. I did all the sharpening and everything else that I needed to work on, so it's ready to export. Now, as you can see on the top here, it's a pretty high resolution image, 8,000 pixels wide, 6,000 pixels high. So obviously I do not want that big of a resolution for my first export, which is going to be for Facebook. So I want to share this with my Facebook fans, and I'm going to hit the export window. I can hit Control-Shift-E, or I can go to File, and I've got Export. So here you've got a bunch of different options, and I'm going to go through these one at a time. So the first thing that we have here is on the very top, you've got Export To, and you can select email, hard drive, CD, DVD. Personally, I never choose any of these. And the reason why I don't do that is because I export it to a hard drive, then pick it up from the location on my hard drive. So in this case, I'm just going to pick hard drive here. You've got this window here on the left side that says presets, and I'll go over presets in a minute. So we're not going to go there yet, but here is the main section. So the first window we here see is the export location. And the option here is a specific folder, and you can choose these predefined ones, but I always choose specific folder because I know where I'm going to export to. And part of my workflow is creating a folder called Lightroom Export, and I always have this on all of my computers. And the reason why I do that is because I need to know just one location where I'll always export to. So if I click choose, as you can see on my C drive, Lightroom Export is empty. I'm going to go ahead and select the folder. The nice thing here is that once you choose a folder, if you have specific shoots, you can actually select this option, put in subfolder, and name it. So for example, if I say I'm going to name this Death Valley, it's going to create another folder under my main folder Lightroom Export called Death Valley. In this case, I really don't care for that, so I'm going to uncheck that. And then you also have the option to add the image after it's exported to a catalog. And this is something I never do, and I do not recommend that you do, because you're going to end up duplicating your efforts. You're going to have a RAW file and a JPEG file, basically the same image, in your Lightroom catalog. As I've said before, I normally just use Lightroom for doing my post-processing in RAW images, and I do not store my extracted JPEG images there. So I'm going to skip over these options, and then you're going to have another option here that says if you have an existing file and it's already been extracted and it has exactly the same file name, what do you want to do? And here you've got the option ask what to do. You could override without warning, skip, and choose a new name. So I always select this ask what to do. All right, so next we've got file naming. And file naming is something that if you follow the workflow that we recommended, which is to, when you import the images, you rename the images on the fly. I already have my image named the way that I want, but you still have the option. So if I don't want to do anything and I want to extract the image the way it is, it's going to keep this 2016-01-13 Death Valley trip -0057 dot, and then whatever extension I use depending on the type of export that I choose here underneath. So if you want to rename it, you would have to check this, and you can give it different names, and you could even define your own preset that you created before, and this is your option to do it from here. So I'm not going to worry about this, and I am simply going to uncheck that. But you can also choose, for example, the lowercase or uppercase for the extension that it's going to create. Next is video. Obviously, this is not a video. This is just an image, so everything is grayed out. I'm going to just collapse that. All right, let's talk about file settings now. And the first option that I've got here as a drop down is image format. And as you can see, I have a bunch of options. Now, original is the original raw file. I don't need to re-extract it from Lightroom. DNG and PSD are Adobe's formats. I practically never use those either. But the two that I use the most are going to be TIFF and Jpeg. So let's talk about TIFF first. So TIFF is something that is going to be acceptable for printing, for example. And the reason why is because TIFF can retain all the image quality without losing anything due to compression. Although you have the option for compression, it's not actually going to reduce the image quality itself. It's going to just make the image a little bit smaller. Then you've got the options for color space, which again, depending on who you work with, you have the option to embed sRGB, Adobe RGB, and even ProPhoto RGB that is the highest color space between these three. Then you've got the option for bit depth, and some images contain up to 16 bits of information here, so you can store that, or if you go lower, you can just extract in 8 bits. Now, extracting in 16 bits is going to make the image much larger in size. But the reason why most people don't use this option is because, like I said, it's going to generate enormous images. So if the printing company is going to be able to accept TIFF files, you actually want to extract images in this specific format because it's going to provide the best quality. So the next option is going to be Jpeg, and this is the one that you're probably going to be using the most. Now, when I selected this Jpeg option, as you can see, now I have another setting here called quality. Now, Jpeg is going to be much smaller in size than TIFF because it has the ability to use different compression, and you can go all the way from 0 here in terms of quality to 100. Now, 100 is the best possible quality. When you use that, it's going to generate large images. But when you go all the way to 0, it's going to generate smaller images. However, the images are going to lack a lot of detail, and most of the color information is going to be lost because there's so much compression taking place that it's not going to look good. So you have to pick a value that works the best. And you might be wondering, well, what is the best value? Obviously, you've got from 0 to 100. It's just too many numbers in there. Now, we wrote a specific article that addresses this question. If I go to the website, this article is called JPEG Compression Levels in Photoshop and Lightroom. In Photoshop, you have JPEG compression levels from 0 to 12, and then in Lightroom, you've got 0 to 100. Now, they have equivalent values. So for example, if you say, well, if I export an image in Lightroom, say in value 100, you might be wondering, well, what's the difference between that 100 and 95? And the answer is, there is no difference. I wish Adobe kept it in line with what they've been doing in Adobe Photoshop, but long story short, a value of 93 to 100 is going to yield an identical image in Lightroom. So keep this in mind as you do this. If you are wondering about these differences in percentages, if you look at this table, you will know what these percentages actually represent. So what is the best value? Well, unfortunately, there is no quick answer for that. And the reason why is because it depends on the type of the image that you're working with. For example, if you have an image with a blue sky, there's probably going to be some variance between one side of the frame to the other. The sky is probably not going to be evenly blue. And in that case, what you might see is if you choose too low of a value as you do the quality, when you export the image, you might see something called posterization. And the effect of posterization is something that's going to be very pronounced and visible because you're going to see one shade of blue, and then there's going to be a kind of a separation between that and the next shade of blue. So it's going to potentially result in these weird looking posterized images. So depending on the type of the image that you work with, you might want to play with this quality setting. Now, if you were to ask me what my personal preference and where I start with is I typically just go with 80. Now, if we go back to this table and refer to these values, as you can see, if I choose anything between 77 and 84, it's going to give me exactly the same image size. And a compression in terms of space saving is going to be roughly 212%. So if that's the case, then that's a good number to start with for me. Now, if I have something that I'm exporting and say I'm exporting for print and the printing company says, no, we do not accept TIFF images, then in that case, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to export in JPEG, but I'm going to export in 100%. So in this case, again, I am only worried about ultimate image quality because I want my print to look the best. But for web use, I never use 100. And the reason for that is because if I export something in 100% quality, a social media platform like Facebook, for example, is going to look at the image and it has its own algorithm. As you upload the image, it might say, well, the image has a small resolution, but the image size is too big. And it's going to go ahead and apply compression anyway. To avoid that, if you use something that actually is small enough for the resolution that you're extracting, then it might not do that and the image is going to look the best. So in this case, if I'm exporting for, say, Facebook, I'm going to pick something like 80. Now, the next option I've got is color space, and by default, it should be sRGB, but you have two other options. Now, while these other options for color space, they're gonna give you more flexibility in terms of the number of colors that you can store in that particular image, unfortunately, most devices out there, they do not have the ability to see these color spaces. So my recommendation would be to keep it at sRGB. Whenever you share images on the web, you should always use sRGB as the default. Now, the next option we're going to have here is limit file size to. If you have a specific requirement, for example, a website that says you cannot upload more than this size and it gives you a physical size limitation, you can actually use this field. Now, if I check this field, as you can see, the quality now is grayed out. And the reason for that is because depending on the size that I limit this to, for example, if I say 2000, which would be 2000 kilobytes equivalent to 2 megabytes, then it will automatically pick for the resolution that I'm working on what type of quality compression to apply to that image. So I personally don't use this method at all because I don't look at website regulations in terms of size. Whenever I export an image, as long as the resolution is going to be small enough, the quality of 80 should work in most cases. I've never seen a website that has too small of a limitation that you cannot work around the quality setting. So in this case, I'm just going to skip that option. Next, we've got image sizing. And this is the important one because this is where you look at the guideline of the media platform that you're uploading to and then decide on what resolution to extract the image at. Remember, this image is 8256 horizontally in terms of number of pixels and 6192. That's too big of a resolution. I'm not intending to export it at that size unless I print. So in this case, what I'm going to do, I've got a couple of options. So first of all, you want to make sure that this Resize To Fit option is checked. Then you've got a bunch of options here. I never use percentage, megapixels, and typically I use these four, but specifically, I prefer to use the long edge. In this case, what I'm going to do for this particular image, since it's a horizontal image, I just need to select what that long edge is going to be. So 2048 pixels on the long edge is going to satisfy that Facebook requirement, and that's exactly what I'm going to use. So long edge works really well, and you've got other options here like width and height, where you can specify in pixels what the width and the height of the image is supposed to be. Now, one thing that the export window will not do is apply cropping, and this is something that's important for you to understand. So if I select something that is going to be different than the aspect ratio of the original photo, for example, if I say here, extract it at 2048, but the height is 2048 as well, what is this going to do? It's going to use that higher setting for the width, and it's going to ignore my other setting because it's not going to stretch the image to have the same size in terms of width and height. So for that reason alone, I personally try not to use this setting or the dimensions. I typically just go for the long edge. So let's extract it at 2048 pixels. There's another option right here that says don't enlarge. So if you have an image that's small and you specify too high of a resolution in terms of pixels, by checking this, you're basically telling Lightroom not to enlarge the image. So typically I don't do that. I don't enlarge my images. So whether I have it checked or not checked doesn't matter. The next thing I've got here is resolution. Now, some photographers might say, well, you need to specify the resolution. Actually doesn't mean anything if you're exporting this for the web. And the reason why is because this is only used for printing. So by default, you're gonna have something like 240. Even if I type in 2,400 or 24,000, when I export this image, you will see it will make no difference whatsoever. So keep in mind that resolution is only for printing. So I'm just gonna go back to the original 240 here. The next option we've got is sharpening. Now, this is something that is important that I want to explain a little bit more detail. And the reason why is because if I'm looking at this original image, let me go back here. I'm going to go ahead and cancel through that window, and I'm going to go to the develop module. Now, this image in particular has already been post-processed. So I've got everything already applied to the image. And if I scroll down here into the sharpening area here in detail, as you can see, I already applied some sharpening to this image. In fact, if I click on this image, you can see there's lots of detail on the rocks. If I reduce the sharpening to 0, then obviously that sharpening is now gone. So that sharpening setting is important for the full size image. If I were to extract it in the original size, that sharpening would matter. However, for the export window, if I go back to my export window, that sharpening really means nothing, because what I'm doing here, I'm essentially reducing the image from 8,256 pixels wide to 2,048 pixels wide. By doing that, I'm essentially using something called a downsampling technique, where the computer has its own algorithm and is saying, well, I'm going to take 5 pixels and convert those 5 pixels into 1 pixel. Throughout that process, what's happening is it's essentially doing a little bit of sharpening, but not in the sense that we look at here. What it's doing is essentially increasing the amount of detail, because now if you have something that is not very sharp, when you reduce it to a small size, it might appear sharp, just because now you're taking a lot more information and reducing it to less information. So here, that's exactly what I'm doing. And as I do this, unfortunately, the sharpening that I applied in my Lightroom to that full-size image is not going to matter. So I need to apply something called output sharpening, which is when Lightroom exports the image, it's going to run a separate process of sharpening on top of that. So here I've got the option that says sharpen for. If I uncheck it, there's going to be no sharpening. So in that case, it's just going to downsample it and make it smaller. But if I check that, it's going to apply that additional level of sharpening. So here we've got a couple of options. I've got screen, matte paper, glossy paper. And as you can tell, these two options are for printing. So if you're doing the exporting for printing, you can select these options and specify the level of sharpening that you want. Unfortunately, there's no way for me to go into too much detail as I have in Lightroom right here with the radius, amount, and the detail that I can specify, because Lightroom or Adobe just forces me to choose between these three options. So by default, I'm going to pick screen here because I'm doing this for exporting to the web. And then the amount, I have to choose between low, standard, and high. Now, for a landscape image like this, I'm going to typically select high. And the reason why I do that is because I want all those rocks and all those details to look really crisp. However, if I were working on a portrait and I do not want all the facial features to be really evident in my photo, if I do not want to show the wrinkles, and all these facial details, then I'm probably going to just choose low. So if you're a portrait photographer, you might not be happy with high because you're going to have too much sharpening applied to the image. But for a landscape photo, I personally prefer high, and that works for me the best. So I'm going to go ahead and select that. And the next option I've got here is metadata. Now, metadata is information that's embedded into the image. We talked about EXIF information before, which is basically a header information that contains all information like what type of camera you were using, what type of lens you were using at the time you took the picture, the date and time, and all these other things. All that information is called metadata. Now, there's additional layer of metadata that you can add in Lightroom, and all of that information like copyright and maybe even other potential information that you might want to insert into the images, all of that is called metadata, and it's stored right here, and I can actually choose between different options. So if I choose all metadata, whatever information I put in there is going to be extracted with the image. And it's potentially even going to take things like keywords as part of that image. So if I do not want that, I have several options here. I could say, you know what, give me all except camera and camera raw info, which is going to basically keep my copyright information and other things, but it's not going to preserve the camera information. Another option is copyrighted contact info only, and this is something that Lola, for example, my wife, when she extracts images, that's what she uses because she wants to retain her copyright and contact information in each image that she extracts. Or you could just do copyright only. So for this image, I don't mind extracting all that information that came with it, but if you wanted to retain smaller size, if that image is not going to contain all the metadata, it's going to be just a little bit smaller. So it's totally your choice. I typically go with all metadata, but if you do not want other people to see what camera you used and all these other things, you could select copyright and contact info only. So when I select that, as you can see, these options are grayed out. But if I do all metadata, I do also have the option to remove specific things. Like I could say write keywords as Lightroom hierarchy, remove person info, or remove location info if I have like GPS information stored in the image. So I could select that, and Lightroom will automatically discard that information as it extracts the image. Next, we've got watermarking. Now this one is, we're gonna have to spend a little bit more time explaining this, and the reason why is because there's lots of different options underneath. So if I check this watermark, what it's going to do is I have the option in Lightroom as it exports the image to embed my watermark information into that image. And I can do it in several ways. I can put in some text information, just something as basic as copyright Nassim Mansourov, for example, or I could do my existing image. If I have a logo for my business, I could use that logo to embed into each image. So let's go over these options real quick. I'm going to go ahead and click on this field, and I'm going to edit watermarks. So here, like I said, I've got a couple options. So first of all, on the top, you've got different ways you can actually save your watermarks, and I'm gonna do that in a second. You've got two options for the watermark style. You've got text and graphic. So I'm gonna choose text for now. So if I wanted to do something as basic as copyright, and then just maybe put a C sign, and then put in my name, I can do that. And now I can resize that, so I can make it smaller or bigger, as you can see. And I've got the other option of moving it around. So I've got a bunch of different options just for text here. Let's go through these real quick. So under text options, I can select the font. So by default, it's Myriad Web Pro right now, which I don't mind. And then the style, you can bold it. You can, do all that italic or whatever you want. So I'm just gonna pick italic for now. And then you can align it. And this is just basically the text alignment as in software like Word. You can select a different color. So I can choose between different colors here. And if I move this up, as you can see, I have all these options for different colors. So let's just say I'm gonna make it red. In fact, no, I don't like that. I'm just gonna go plain white. And then here you've got different options. So you could say, I want to add a shadow. And if I check that and uncheck, you can't really see it from here because it's a little bit small. So if we just make it a little bit bigger, in fact, let me just make this window just a tad larger so we can see more detail here. There we go, that's much better. All right, so here, if I click on the shadow, as you can see, you can tell that the software is adding a shadow right behind that. And the nice thing is you can actually change the offset, so you can move that shadow closer or further away, do the radius and all these things. So I personally don't play with this too much because I don't work with text watermarks, but as you can see, you have plenty of options on how you want to do it, even change the angle here. So let's reduce this. This is way too big and I don't like that. So you normally want to have something like that. And then further down below, you change the opacity. So I can go from 0 all the way to 100. You typically do not want to do 100 and just have maybe a slight overlay there, maybe something like 70%. And then you can choose the size here. And as you can see, it's a similar thing as I was dragging earlier. So probably want to keep it a little bit smaller there. And then you've got also other options for moving it around. So if I wanted to just move it further down and then move it up a little bit, I can do that from here. Now another one right here is an anchor, and right now it's going to apply this copyright watermark on the bottom left side of the image, and that's because it's selected here. So if I wanted to move that around, as you can see, I can actually move it to pretty much any area of the image. And the reason why this is important is because typically you'll have images where wherever you're placing the watermark, maybe it works really well for this image, but if I have another image where maybe there's something important where the copyright watermark is, I might actually want to move it to another area. So typically what you want to do is you want to create different presets and put the anchors in different locations. And I'll go through that in a second as I talk about the graphic option. So text, like I said, I personally don't use it, but if you don't have a logo for your business, then it works as well. So I'm gonna go ahead and select graphic. And the reason why is because I do have a logo, and it's stored right here on the logo folder of my computer. And as you can see, this is just a Photography Life logo. And the nice thing about this is that it's an image and it looks much nicer than just pure text. So in this case, I can actually do the same thing. I have all these options grayed out because it's no longer a text, but I can still work on things like opacity. So I can make it as bright as I want, or just change the transparency to something like 50% so that it's not as visible. So I personally prefer doing something like between 50 to 60% because I don't want it to pop from the image and distract the person's eye. Sometimes, depending on what I do, I might reduce that further down. So let's just keep it around 50 right now. And then here, the size, obviously you do not want to have something massive. So typically you want to have something smaller. And in this case, maybe let's just do something like 10. And now the next option is the anchor. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start from the top left and I'm going to create a preset. So everything that I've done so far, the nice thing is I can actually now save it as a preset. So I'm going to save it as a preset and call it PL-top left because that's where I'm placing it. I'm going to go ahead and create. Then I'm going to place that to the right and I'm going to save it as a new preset. All right, so now that I have 4 of them created, what this allows me to do is once I click done, now I have the option to select that. And again, depending on the type of the image that you're working on, you might want to move it around. So if for one image, the bottom left is gonna work, for another image, maybe top right is gonna work better. So in this case, I don't mind the bottom left side. So let's go ahead and select that. Then the last option here is post-processing. Now here, I've got a bunch of options, and if you want to export an image from Lightroom and then open it up in Photoshop and do some further work on it, you can actually have that option here. But I personally don't do that. There's really no reason to do that for this particular image. But you have the option to even open it in another application if you want to. What I typically do is I select Show and Explore. And the reason why is because after I extract the image, I want my computer to show me where the image was extracted to. I already know where it is, but it just saves me the extra step of going through and do that on the computer. So we've got everything ready. Now, the next thing we want to do before we hit export, all that work that I put into this, let's just save this because I'm doing this for Facebook, and the nice thing about everything that I've done so far is that I can actually preserve all the changes specifically for Facebook here. So I've got the option here to name the preset. I'm going to type in Facebook and I'm going to go ahead and click create. Now, everything that I've done is saved under Facebook and it's saved all these different options. So let's go ahead and export. There we go. So the image has been exported. So let's take a look at it now. I'm going to go ahead and double click it. And as you can see, the watermark is there. The image looks nice, but there is a problem. And if I go ahead and go back to Lightroom, you can see that the colors of the image here are way different than the colors here. Why is that? My photo application here does not read color profiles. So when I extracted the image, it saved the color profile, that sRGB, into the image. And this software in particular does not understand colors. So it's basically not color managed. Because of that, the image appears very different. So if you extract the image and it looks completely different, just bear in mind that your photo application might be the one to blame. Now, if I go back to my Chrome here, and Chrome is a color managed browser, and if I press Control-O and navigate to that image and open it up, Look at that. It looks exactly the same as it does in Lightroom. There's no difference. Again, the reason why is because Chrome, the browser, can actually look at the image, extract the color profile from the image, and then apply it to the image. That's why it looks fine. So just keep that in mind as you work with images. You might be frustrated just because the images appear different in color. But in reality, it's not because the image is extracted differently, it's just because your application can't view it properly. Now that we have our image extracted for Facebook and I'm ready to post it, let's actually create a couple of more presets. And this time what I'm going to do, I'm going to open up the export window, and we're going to modify these settings a little bit. I want to create 2 presets for printing specifically. So what I'll do is, for the first one, I'm going to create one for TIFF, and this one is, like I said, is going to generate a large image, because when I export for printing, I'm not going to downsample the image, which means I'm not actually going to use this image resizing option. This is something important because obviously I want the image to be in highest resolution possible so that I can make the finest and the most detailed print. So in this case, and again, it depends on your printing size, but we're not going to go into those details. So in this case, I just want to export in full resolution for print. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pick TIFF. Now, the next option is I want to uncheck Resize to Fit because I want to extract this image in its full resolution. Next, we've got output sharpening. Now, this is the important part because what I'm doing right now is I'm telling Lightroom to export the image as is. And I already have sharpening applied in Lightroom. As you can see here, 50, 150, and I applied a little bit of masking. If I extract it and I have the sharpen turned on, it's going to extract the image with those sharpening settings, and it's going to apply additional layer of sharpening, which I obviously do not want. So I'm going to go ahead and uncheck that. And the rest of the stuff, I obviously do not want my copyright there, so I'm just going to go ahead and uncheck that watermark there. And we're going to go ahead and click Add and save this as print. And in brackets, I'll specify that this is TIFF format. So go ahead and create that. So now this option is going to be good for TIFF. I'm going to create another one, which for most labs that you would be working with, you're probably going to have just the option to upload JPEG images. So let's go ahead and create another one. For this one, I want everything in highest resolution possible. Size of the image doesn't really matter. By default, I'm going to still keep sRGB as the option for color space unless the lab tells me otherwise. And then here, again, we're not going to resize the image because I want everything to be in highest resolution possible. And then no further changes to sharpening here, and no watermark. So let's go ahead and add, and I'm going to call it print JPEG. All right, so now that we created them, the nice thing about this is that I've got these presets saved. So if I click Facebook, all of the images, all of the settings that I've actually previously worked on are still saved, including my watermark. If I click JPEG, everything, as you can see, applies to JPEG, and then TIFF is the same way. So let's go ahead and do a sample extraction of a print size JPEG, and let's see the difference at 100% quality at the highest resolution. I'm going to go ahead and click export. We're going to use a unique name because Lightroom is smart enough to know that I already had an image there before. I do not want to overwrite it, so we're going to click on use unique names. And as soon as it's done extracting, now this is going to take a little bit longer because it's now obviously rendering far more pixels in this image. So let's take a look. All right, so look at that. That image with 8,000 pixels at 100% quality just made a massive 40 megabyte file. That's huge. So if we open this image up, as you can see, it took even a little bit longer. But if I zoom in now, you will see a lot of details compared to the other image. As you can see, it's super, super high resolution image. And all those sharpening settings that I applied to the image, they're visible here. Let's just summarize everything that we've done so far. So the export window can be complex. There's a lot of stuff that we talked about here. But the most important thing is no matter what type of media platform you're trying to export your images to, it's always a good idea to save these as presets. So I went ahead and created 3. On my normal computer, I would have one for Instagram, one for my website, for example, where I have completely different resolution. That way, I don't have to mess with any of these settings as I export. So these are the settings that I personally use. They work great for me, but if you have something different that works for you, then go ahead and use that.